That morning began like thousands before it. Coffee brewed, radios hummed softly, and front doors closed with familiar sounds. No one noticed it yet, but something in America had quietly shifted overnight. What if the most important turning point didn't arrive with sirens, but with silence? The sun rose slowly over small towns and large cities alike, casting the same pale orange light across cracked sidewalks, modest houses and factory parking lots already beginning to fill. In 1970s America, mornings followed routines so precise they felt eternal. Kitchen tables were crowded with newspapers, most folded to the same pages: gasoline prices, layoffs, distant wars described in careful language. Radios murmured familiar voices, calm and reassuring, as if repetition itself could hold the world together. Outside, the air smelled of exhaust and damp asphalt. Engines coughed awake. A school bus hissed to a stop, its brakes screeching just long enough to make a few heads turn before everyone looked away again. Everyone seemed to be listening, yet no one was talking. Factories opened their doors with metallic groans that echoed like tired sighs. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing faintly overhead. Men and women took their places along assembly lines, hands moving from memory rather than thought. There was comfort in the rhythm, but also a growing unease no one could quite name. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in lunchboxes that stayed closed a little longer, in eyes that avoided mirrors. Was it exhaustion or fear that kept the room so quiet? The smell of oil clung to work clothes. The constant hum of machines pressed against eardrums until silence itself felt suspicious. Even the air felt heavier, as though it carried questions no one dared to ask. Children sensed it too, though they didn't yet understand. It felt it in the way adults laughed a second too late, or hugged a second too tight. If something was wrong, why did no one explain it? By mid-morning, rumors began to drift. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. A department might close, a shift might end early, a company might restructure, a word gentle enough to soften the blow. But if everything was fine, why were people whispering? No alarm sounded. No announcements were made. Yet across America, thousands of people felt the same quiet thought form at once. What if tomorrow doesn't look like today? At home, televisions murmured through half-empty living rooms, while laundry folded itself into careful stacks. Cheerful hosts spoke of abundance and optimism. Commercials promised happiness in small packages: new cars, better kitchens, brighter futures. Bills, meanwhile, were stacked neatly out of sight. Conversations about money were postponed until later. Always later, because once fears were spoken aloud, they had a way of becoming real. Imagine sitting at that table. Imagine knowing something is wrong but not knowing how to fix it. Would you speak or stay quiet to protect the people you love? As the afternoon approached, a sound cut through the ordinary rhythm of the day. Subtle but unmistakable. A factory whistle blew at the wrong time. Phones began ringing in offices where phones almost never rang. Somewhere, a door closed that would not open again. But no one yet understood what that sound truly meant, or how deeply it would reshape everything that followed. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the feeling that something had shifted was no longer subtle. It lingered in hallways, followed people home, sat quietly between spouses, who had known each other for decades yet suddenly struggled to find the right words. The day had not exploded into chaos, it had simply bent, slightly but enough to never fully return to its original shape. At factories, supervisors gathered in corners they rarely used, their voices lowered not out of secrecy but habit. Clipboards were held tighter. Lists were checked twice. Some workers were told to clock out early, reassured with phrases that sounded temporary, almost kind. Just for today? We'll know more tomorrow. But tomorrow had started to feel like an uncertain place, hadn't it? The sound inside those buildings changed first. Machines slowed, then stopped in uneven waves, leaving behind a ringing silence that pressed against the chest. Without the constant mechanical hum, people became aware of their own breathing, of the scuff of shoes on concrete, of how loudly fear could exist without making a sound. If this was only a pause, why did it feel so final? Outside, parking lots emptied sooner than usual. Engines started without conversation. Cars pulled away one by one, tail lights glowing red in the afternoon haze like quiet warnings. No one waved. No one lingered. Everyone seemed to sense that staying too long might invite answers they weren't ready to hear. In neighborhoods built on routine, the disruption was small but unmistakable. Children arrived home earlier than expected. Doors opened at unfamiliar hours. Mothers and fathers exchanged looks instead of explanations. Dinner preparations began in silence, punctuated only by the clink of utensils and the distant murmur of the evening news. Words like temporary slowdown and economic adjustment floated through the room, carefully chosen and completely hollow. If everything was under control, why did no one sound convinced? The news anchors spoke steadily, professionally, as images of distant events filled the screen. Lines outside gas stations, protests in cities far away, numbers rising, graphs falling. The tone suggested manageability, but the subtext told another story. A story about a country trying to reassure itself while quietly losing confidence. How long could reassurance replace truth? In living rooms across America, people sat closer to their televisions than usual, not because they expected answers, but because silence had begun to feel unbearable. The glow of the screen reflected in tired eyes that had seen stability for years and now struggled to recognize its outline. Was this just another cycle, or the beginning of something that wouldn't easily pass? Later that evening, phone calls were made. Not frantic, not dramatic, measured. Brothers checking on brothers. Friends asking careful questions. Did you hear anything? Are you affected? The answers were vague, unsatisfying. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Because once spoken, uncertainty became real, and real things demanded decisions. Children sensed the shift even more acutely at night. Bedtime stories felt rushed. Kisses lingered longer. Lights were turned off gently, as if darkness itself needed to be handled with care. In quiet bedrooms, young minds tried to understand emotions they had no language for. If grown-ups were scared, what was there to be afraid of? As night settled in, America did what it had always done. It waited. It waited in kitchens with cold coffee. It waited in cars parked a little longer than necessary. It waited in the soft hum of refrigerators and the ticking of clocks that suddenly felt too loud. Waiting because action required clarity, and clarity had not yet arrived. But somewhere beneath the stillness, something irreversible had already begun. Trust in systems, in promises, in the idea that hard work guaranteed security had cracked, just slightly, enough to let doubt seep in. And as people finally went to sleep, unaware that they were carrying the weight of a changing era into their dreams. One question lingered unspoken across the country. If today could change this quietly, what would tomorrow take away? Morning arrived again, but it did not feel like a reset. It felt like a continuation of something unfinished. The sun rose on the same streets, the same houses, the same factories, but the familiarity no longer brought comfort. It only highlighted what had changed beneath the surface. People woke earlier than usual, not because they needed to, but because sleep had been shallow and restless. Coffee tasted bitter. Radio sounded louder. Newspapers were opened more carefully, as if the pages might confirm what everyone already suspected. Words like slow down, uncertainty, and temporary measures appeared again. Repeated so often, they began to lose meaning. If these measures were temporary, why did they feel permanent? At work, routines resumed, but without conviction. Hands moved, but minds drifted. Conversations circled the same careful topics before dissolving into silence. Supervisors avoided eye contact. Decisions were delayed. Waiting replaced planning. And waiting, stretched too long, began to feel like neglect. In schools, teachers noticed it in the children first. Questions were sharper. Attention wandered. Some kids stared out windows longer than necessary, watching their parents' cars disappear in the mornings. Others spoke less, conserving words they didn't yet understand, they might need later. If home no longer felt certain, where was certainty supposed to come from? Grocery stores told their own quiet story. A few shelves were thinner than before. Prices had shifted just enough to be noticed. People paused longer in aisles, doing mental math they had never needed to do. Items were put back carefully, almost apologetically. No one admitted they were worried, but everyone behaved as if they were. The sound of America changed again. Less laughter in public spaces. More coughing, more sighing. Television stayed on longer, even when no one was watching. Radios filled cars with voices that tried to sound informed, authoritative, reassuring. But reassurance had started to feel like a performance, and audiences were growing skeptical. At night, conversations grew heavier. Couples lay awake, staring at ceilings, whispering fears they would never say during daylight. What if overtime disappeared? What if the plant closed? What if one paycheck stopped being enough? These were not dramatic questions. They were practical ones. And practicality, when mixed with uncertainty, became terrifying. Communities that had once relied on shared strength began to test that trust. Church meetings grew more crowded but less hopeful. Town halls filled with polite frustration. People listened, nodded, and went home with the same unanswered questions they had arrived with. If leaders didn't know what was coming, who did? Still, no one called it a crisis. That word carried too much weight. Instead, there were euphemisms, gentle phrases designed to delay panic. But delay has consequences. The longer the truth is postponed, the harder it becomes to accept. How long could a country live between denial and reality? Children sensed it in small, unforgettable ways. A birthday celebrated with fewer gifts. A family trip quietly canceled. A promise postponed without explanation. These moments did not feel historic at the time, but they would be remembered, because this was how change entered lives, not through headlines, but through absence. As days passed, the idea of stability began to feel fragile. People still showed up, still worked, still smiled when required, but beneath the surface something essential was eroding. The belief that tomorrow would naturally be better than today. When that belief weakens, what replaces it? And then came the first confirmations. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Notices posted, shifts reduced, benefits reviewed, words printed on paper that could not be folded away or ignored. The future, once abstract, had begun to take shape, and it did not look familiar. That night, as lights went out across cities and towns, America lay awake with a realization it had been avoiding. This was no longer just a bad week. It was the beginning of a different life. And if this was only the beginning, how much more would have to be lost before anyone truly pushed back? The shift from uncertainty to reality did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine. Notices were posted without ceremony. Meetings were scheduled and then shortened. Words like efficiency and realignment replaced reassurance. What had once been rumors now lived in ink, pinned to cork boards and taped to doors where everyone could see them. Inside factories and offices, the atmosphere tightened. People counted days, then hours. They learned who had been let go not through announcements, but through absence. A locker left unopened. A name no longer called. A parking space that stayed empty. Each gap told a story no one wanted to hear. Trust began to fracture, not dramatically, but painfully. Co-workers watched one another more closely. Whispers grew sharper. Someone must have known more. Someone must have seen it coming. The idea that survival might require advantage slipped into conversations, quietly reshaping them. When resources shrink, does loyalty follow? In small towns, the effects spread outward. Diners grew quieter. Tips became smaller. Store owners extended credit they weren't sure they'd recover. Smiles remained, but they were practiced now, careful. Everyone was adjusting, but no one was admitting it. Adjustment felt too close to surrender. At home, the strain showed in new ways. Arguments started over small things, missed chores, forgotten errands. But everyone knew the real cause lay deeper. Money conversations, once avoided, became unavoidable. Papers were spread across tables late at night. Numbers were rewritten again and again, as if different math might produce a better outcome. How many weeks could a family last if nothing improved? Children watched all of this from the edges. They learned new rules without being taught. Don't ask for extras. Don't complain. Don't make things harder. They noticed when adults spoke in lowered voices, when doors were closed during conversations that used to be open. They understood instinctively that something had been taken and that it might not be returned. Community spaces began to reflect the change. Church sermons shifted in tone, less gratitude, more endurance. Food drives expanded quietly, without publicity. Help was offered discreetly to preserve dignity. But dignity, under pressure, becomes fragile. How long could pride protect people from necessity? Then came the moments that felt like betrayal. Longtime workers passed over, promises reversed, decisions justified by numbers rather than faces. For some it felt personal, even if it wasn't meant to be. When systems fail individuals, who carries the blame? The sense of fairness that had once anchored daily life began to erode. Hard work no longer guaranteed stability. Loyalty no longer promised protection. The rules had changed, but no one had explained the new ones. In that confusion, resentment found space to grow. As weeks passed, the emotional toll deepened. Sleep became irregular. Patience thinned. Laughter returned less often, and when it did, it sounded different, shorter, more cautious. People were learning how to live with less certainty, and the learning was painful. Yet beneath the strain, something else was forming. Not hope, not yet, but awareness. A growing recognition that waiting would not be enough, that endurance without action had limits, that survival might soon demand choices no one wanted to make. And as another night settled in, one thought moved silently through towns and cities alike. If this is what happens when stability cracks, what will happen when it finally breaks? By the time survival became a conscious thought, something essential had already changed. The idea that effort alone could fix everything no longer held. People still worked when work was available, still showed up where they were expected to be, but the meaning of showing up had shifted. It was no longer about progress, it was about holding ground. Morning routines grew thinner. Fewer lights turned on at once. Thermostats stayed lower. Meals became simpler, stretched across more days. These adjustments were never announced. They were understood. Everyone was learning how to live with less without admitting that less had become permanent. In neighborhoods, quiet negotiations replaced casual interactions. Tools were borrowed and returned with extra care. Favors were remembered, tracked, weighed. Community still existed, but it was cautious now, measured. Generosity required calculation. If helping today meant risking tomorrow, how much could anyone afford to give? Some adapted faster than others. They found side work, took longer commutes, accepted jobs beneath their experience. Pride was folded away like an old uniform that no longer fit. Others struggled to adjust, held back by age, health, or obligation. The gap between those who could bend and those who could not began to widen, and with it, a quiet tension. The emotional weight pressed hardest at night. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams replayed old certainties, steady paychecks, predictable weeks, before dissolving into half-remembered anxiety. People woke with clenched jaws, with thoughts already racing. How long could this version of life be sustained? Children became careful observers. They learned the value of things not through lessons, but through absence. New clothes were rare. Outings were postponed. Gifts were smaller, sometimes homemade. Yet disappointment was rarely voiced. They understood without being told that restraint was a form of love. Public spaces reflected the shift. Libraries filled. Parks grew quieter but more occupied. Places that cost nothing became refuges. Conversations there were softer, more personal. Strangers shared stories they might once have kept private. When resources shrink, experience becomes currency. But survival is not neutral. It changes people. In some it awakened resilience, in others bitterness. Patience wore thin. Small conflicts escalated faster. A glance held too long. A word chosen poorly. Stress magnified everything. How much pressure could a community endure before it fractured? The idea of the future narrowed. Long-term plans were replaced with short horizons. Weeks mattered more than years. The question was no longer, where are we going? But can we make it through this? When vision contracts, so does hope. Still, beneath the strain, a new awareness settled in. This was not an interruption, it was a condition. And conditions demand adaptation, not denial. People began to understand that survival was no longer temporary, it was the new skill everyone was learning. As another day ended, the country sat in a state of uneasy balance, not collapsing, not recovering, suspended between what it had been and what it was becoming. And somewhere in that stillness, a final, unsettling thought took hold. If survival is now the goal, what will be lost when simply getting by is no longer enough? The moment when survival stopped being enough did not announce itself. There was no single event to point to, no headline that captured it. Instead, it arrived through accumulation of fatigue, of compromise, of quiet losses that no one had the energy to mourn properly. Life continued, but it felt thinner, as if something vital had been slowly drained away. Illness lingered longer now. Injuries healed more slowly. Doctor visits were postponed. Prescriptions were stretched. Decisions once made for comfort were now made for necessity. The body, like the economy, was asked to endure more than it had been designed for. How much strain could a person carry before something gave way? In some homes, the loss became literal. An empty chair at the table, a name spoken less often. Grief arrived without ceremony, squeezed between responsibilities that could not be delayed. Funerals were smaller. Time off was brief. Mourning became private. Because public grief required resources no one felt they could spare. The elderly felt it sharply. Fixed incomes lost their meaning. Years of saving no longer guaranteed security. Pride kept many silent, even as needs grew. The fear was not only of poverty, but of becoming invisible. What happens to a society when its oldest members feel forgotten? For others, the breaking point came in different forms. Marriages strained under constant pressure. Arguments hardened into distance. Some people left, not dramatically, not defiantly, but quietly, in search of work, of relief, of air. Departures thinned communities already stretched too far. Each goodbye carried the weight of uncertainty. Yet even as things fell away, something endured. Not optimism, not certainty, but memory. People remembered how life had once felt, and that memory became a quiet measure of loss. It also became a warning. This change was not temporary. It had marked them. Public confidence, once assumed, had eroded beyond repair. Institutions still functioned, but belief in them had weakened. The promise that the system would eventually correct itself no longer convinced everyone. Trust, once broken gradually, does not return easily. What replaces it? As the decade moved forward, the story of that morning, the ordinary one, the one that had seemed insignificant, began to make sense in hindsight. That was when the shift began. Not with panic, not with collapse, but with a subtle realization shared by millions. The future was no longer guaranteed. People adapted because adaptation was necessary. They learned to expect less, to question more, to rely on themselves and each other in quieter ways. Survival had taught them restraint. Loss had taught them clarity. And when they looked back years later, it was not the disasters they remembered most. It was the silence, the calm morning, the routines that held just long enough to hide the moment everything changed. Because history does not always turn on loud days. Sometimes it turns on a normal morning, and the truth of that morning, what it took, and what it left behind, would only fully be understood long after the sound of it had faded.